This channel examines the Jeffrey Epstein case using court documents, public records, and verified reporting. We do not speculate. We do not accuse. We document what exists, and what remains unanswered. Everything presented here is drawn from publicly available sources. This is not a theory channel. This is the file. In the Jeffrey Epstein case, few documents have carried as much symbolic weight as the flight logs. A name, a date, a destination. For many observers, that was enough. When handwritten aviation records began circulating publicly, they quickly transformed from administrative paperwork into something far larger, a perceived ledger of association. But the central question is more precise. Who actually flew on Epstein's aircraft? And just as important, who did not? Understanding that distinction requires moving carefully, methodically, and without assumption. The logs most widely discussed originate from records kept by pilots who operated aircraft linked to Jeffrey Epstein. These records span certain years, not every year. They document specific planes, not necessarily every aircraft ever used. They contain handwritten entries, often abbreviated, sometimes partially redacted. They are not a master list of everyone in Epstein's orbit. They are a partial travel record. That matters. Because over time, a narrative formed online suggesting that the logs represented a comprehensive map of complicity. Lists of names circulated without context. Screenshots were shared without dates. Totals were calculated without distinguishing between business travel, social visits, or one-time events. But documents require interpretation. A name appearing once in a log does not tell the same story as a name appearing repeatedly. Even repeated appearances require context. When did the flights occur? Who else was aboard? What was publicly known at the time? And then there is the other side of the equation. The absence of a name. In public discourse, some individuals were widely rumored to have traveled on Epstein's aircraft, yet their names do not appear in the most commonly circulated logs. In other cases, people publicly acknowledged knowing Epstein but denied ever flying with him. So the discussion becomes twofold. Verified appearances and flight records. Allegations or rumors of travel without documentation. Separating those two categories is essential. It is also essential to recognize that Epstein maintained multiple residences and social venues. Not all travel involving him required private aircraft. Commercial flights, separate charters, and independent travel arrangements complicate any assumption that, if someone knew him, they must appear in the logs. They might not. Likewise, appearing in a log does not automatically imply knowledge of criminal conduct. Many flights occurred years before Epstein's activities became widely exposed. This is where chronology becomes critical. In 2008, Epstein entered a controversial non-prosecution agreement in Florida. Public awareness increased, but even then, not all allegations were broadly understood. Many flights recorded in earlier years predate widespread reporting. Timeline changes interpretation. As we move forward in this series, we will examine documented passengers who appear in the logs. Individuals frequently rumored but not confirmed in records. How misinterpretations took root. Why absence can be as politically charged as presence. The goal is not to defend, not to accuse, but to clarify. Because in high-profile cases, the difference between documentation and assumption determines whether analysis remains factual or drifts into speculation. When discussing Epstein's flight logs, the conversation often jumps straight to recognizable names. But before examining any individual, we need to establish a framework. The logs most frequently cited in public reporting were introduced through court proceedings and later circulated in media coverage. These records, handwritten by pilots, document flights on specific aircraft during specific periods, primarily in the 1990s and early 2000s. They confirm three basic facts. A flight occurred. A route was flown. Certain names were recorded as passengers. Nothing more. Among the documented names appearing in publicly reported logs are high-profile figures from politics, business, and academia, including former U.S. President Bill Clinton and Britain's Prince Andrew. It is important to handle this carefully. In Clinton's case, publicly reported flight logs confirm that he traveled on Epstein's aircraft multiple times during the early 2000s, often in connection with philanthropic initiatives in Africa. Clinton has publicly stated that he was unaware of Epstein's criminal conduct at the time and has denied knowledge of illegal activity. The logs confirm travel. They do not confirm knowledge. They do not confirm participation in wrongdoing. In the case of Prince Andrew, flight logs and additional testimony placed him within Epstein's social orbit. Unlike many other individuals, Prince Andrew later became the subject of civil litigation connected to Epstein associate Ghislaine Maxwell, which he has denied. That legal context is separate from the logs themselves, but it explains why his name drew heightened attention. This illustrates an important distinction. Some individuals appearing in the logs were later directly implicated through allegations or litigation. Many others were not. The logs do not categorize passengers by role, relationship, or awareness. They simply record presence on specific flights. Another layer complicates interpretation, grouping. Flights often included multiple passengers. A single entry might list several names, assistants, staff, friends, colleagues, or guests. Being on the same flight does not necessarily mean close personal connection. Travel logistics do not always reflect social hierarchy. Additionally, some names appear once. Others appear multiple times. Frequency has been used by online commentators to imply deeper involvement, but without additional evidence, frequency alone does not establish criminal knowledge or participation. From a legal standpoint, context determines relevance. Investigators reviewing such logs would examine the timing of the flight relative to known allegations, the destination, other corroborating evidence, communications tied to that trip. Without that broader evidentiary framework, the log entry remains limited. This is where public discourse often diverges from evidentiary standards. A name on a page can feel powerful. It can feel revealing. But a document does not speak beyond what it records. If a name appearing in the logs creates suspicion, a name missing from them can create something else entirely. Speculation. As the Epstein flight logs circulated online, lists began forming, not only of who was recorded, but of who people believed should have been. Public discourse began asking, if they were close to Epstein, why aren't they in the logs? If rumors said they flew, why is there no record? Are there missing pages? This is where absence became almost as charged as presence. But absence from a log can mean several things. The person never flew on that specific aircraft. The flight occurred outside the documented years. Travel happened via commercial airlines. A different aircraft or charter was used. The publicly released logs are incomplete. Each possibility carries different implications. And yet, in online discussions, absence was sometimes interpreted in extreme ways, either as proof of innocence or proof of a cover-up. Both conclusions go beyond what the document can support. Take for example technology entrepreneur Elon Musk. His name has circulated in online conspiracy discussions related to elite networks in general. However, there is no publicly verified record placing him in Epstein's released flight logs. Does absence prove non-association? No. Does it prove a secret cover-up? Also no. It simply means there is no verified entry in the commonly cited logs tying him to those specific recorded flights. The same dynamic has surrounded former President Donald Trump. Publicly available reporting indicates that Trump and Epstein knew each other socially in the 1990s. However, Trump's name does not appear in the most widely circulated Epstein flight logs. Again, that fact alone does not confirm or deny broader association. It only addresses one narrow question: recorded travel on specific aircraft within specific timeframes. The danger emerges when absence becomes narrative fuel. In some circles, the absence of a name is interpreted as evidence that records must be incomplete or intentionally withheld. In others, absence is used as a definitive shield. They weren't on the plane, therefore the conversation ends. But flight logs are not comprehensive relationship maps. They're operational records. Another factor complicates the issue: data fragmentation. Epstein owned or used multiple aircraft at different times. He also traveled internationally, where record-keeping standards and release protocols differ. Publicly unsealed logs represent only what became part of specific legal proceedings. They are not necessarily exhaustive archives of every movement. Understanding this prevents two common logical errors: treating absence as absolute proof of innocence. treating absence as automatic evidence of concealment. In reality, it is often neither. The deeper lesson here is about evidentiary humility. When documents are partial, interpretation must remain cautious. In the public mind, repetition feels meaningful. If a name appears once in a flight log, it raises curiosity. If it appears multiple times, it raises suspicion. But frequency alone is not a verdict. As online communities began analyzing Epstein's flight logs, some users created spreadsheets. They counted appearances. They ranked names by number of recorded flights. The logic seems straightforward. More flights equals closer relationship. Closer relationship equals greater knowledge. But that equation assumes facts not established by the logs themselves. A high number of entries could reflect business collaboration, philanthropic travel, social familiarity, staff or operational roles, repeated travel between major cities. Without contextual evidence, repetition remains just that, repetition. Consider again former President Bill Clinton. His name appears multiple times in publicly reported logs during the early 2000s. These trips have been publicly described as connected to humanitarian initiatives in Africa after his presidency. Does frequency indicate awareness of criminal activity? The logs do not answer that. They confirm travel dates and routes. They do not document conversations, private meetings, or knowledge. The same interpretive caution applies to others whose names appear repeatedly. A frequent passenger might have been traveling for legitimate professional or philanthropic reasons. Alternatively, repetition could prompt further scrutiny, but scrutiny requires additional evidence beyond the count itself. There is also the issue of role. Some names appear many times because they were employees, assistants, pilots, or operational staff. Repetition in that context reflects employment, not elite association. Public spreadsheets rarely distinguish between principal guests, family members, staff, crew. Yet those categories matter. Another complication is geographic routine. Epstein maintained residences in New York, Florida, New Mexico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Frequent travel between these hubs was common. A recurring name might simply reflect someone whose business required regular trips between those locations. Pattern recognition is powerful, but it can mislead when stripped of context. Humans are wired to infer meaning from repetition. In high-profile cases, repetition feels like revelation. But evidentiary standards demand more. Frequency may justify investigation. It does not establish guilt. This distinction is not about minimizing harm or dismissing accountability. It is about preserving the difference between analysis and assumption. There is something especially powerful about a single line in a flight log that lists multiple recognizable names. When several public figures appear together on the same entry, the visual impact alone can spark immediate conclusions. They must have been close. They must have known. They must have discussed something significant. But a shared flight does not automatically equal a shared purpose. Private aviation, especially in elite circles, often operates differently than commercial travel. A host may invite multiple guests heading in the same direction. Assistants, security personnel, staff, or unrelated invitees may share the same aircraft for logistical convenience. A single entry listing 5 names does not explain whether passengers interacted closely, whether they were seated together, whether the trip was business, social, or philanthropic, whether some passengers departed immediately upon landing. The logs do not capture cabin dynamics. They capture departures and arrivals. Yet online interpretation often treats shared entries as evidence of coordinated activity. This is where psychological compression occurs. When multiple recognizable names appear on one line, the mind compresses them into a unified group, as if they formed a tight circle. But in reality, proximity in travel does not automatically indicate proximity in relationship. Consider again the broader public discussion surrounding figures like Bill Clinton. On certain flights recorded in the early 2000s, his name appears alongside other individuals. Those entries confirm simultaneous travel. They do not document shared intent. Similarly, when Prince Andrew appears in flight-related discussions, the narrative often expands beyond the log itself to include later allegations and legal disputes. But the flight entry alone does not narrate events beyond transportation. This distinction matters because group entries visually reinforce a narrative of network cohesion. In public discourse, the flight log page becomes symbolic, almost like a group photograph. But unlike a photograph, it does not reveal interaction, expression, or engagement. It reveals only co-transport. Another overlooked factor is scale. Some flights involved only a few passengers. Others may have involved more. Without full manifest context, including crew, the perception of exclusivity can be exaggerated. Shared travel may raise questions. It may justify deeper inquiry. But it cannot, by itself, establish coordinated misconduct. The difference between logistical overlap and operational conspiracy is substantial and legally critical. As we move forward, we must also address a deeper question. Why did the flight logs become such a focal point in public consciousness, even though they are limited in scope? At some point, Epstein's aircraft stopped being just an aircraft. It became an icon. Media outlets began referring to his private jet with a nickname, one that would be repeated in headlines, documentaries, and online discussions for years. The plane itself became shorthand for secrecy, privilege, and hidden access. And once that happened, every name listed in a flight log carried symbolic weight far beyond aviation logistics. Private jets already occupy a particular place in public imagination. They suggest exclusivity, invitation-only access, closed environments beyond public scrutiny. When criminal allegations later emerged against Jeffrey Epstein, the aircraft became retroactively charged with meaning. Flights that once appeared routine were reinterpreted through the lens of later revelations. This is a powerful psychological phenomenon. When new information changes how we view a person, it also changes how we interpret their past. Travel that once seemed philanthropic, social, or professional becomes suspicious in hindsight. The aircraft became more than transportation. It became a metaphor. And metaphors amplify perception. The nickname associated with Epstein's jet was repeated so frequently that it shaped how audiences processed any mention of the logs. Even neutral references to flight entries felt loaded because the aircraft itself had become culturally coded. This symbolic transformation explains why the logs gained such traction. They were tangible, handwritten, scannable. In a case marked by sealed documents and redactions, the logs were visible, something the public could analyze directly. But symbolism can distort scale. An airplane is a confined space, yes. But it is also a regulated, documented, operational environment with pilots, staff, and flight protocols. The logs record routes and passengers, not secret meetings in isolation. Still, once the plane became a symbol, each recorded trip felt like entry into a hidden world. And that perception shaped online narratives. Names were no longer just passengers. They became characters in a broader story, whether or not the log itself supported that narrative. This doesn't minimize the seriousness of Epstein's crimes. It highlights how easily documentation can transform into mythology when filtered through outrage and mistrust. In 2008, everything shifted. Before that year, many flights recorded in Epstein's logs were interpreted, at least publicly, as routine movements within elite social and professional circles. After 2008, they were viewed through a different lens. That was the year Epstein entered into a controversial non-prosecution agreement in Florida. The deal, negotiated by federal prosecutors, allowed him to plead guilty to state charges while avoiding federal prosecution at the time. When news of that agreement became widely known, public awareness increased dramatically. And with awareness came reinterpretation. Flights that occurred in the 1990s and early 2000s, years before widespread public reporting, were now examined retroactively. People began asking, if this happened later, what did others know earlier? But hindsight is powerful, and potentially distorting. A flight in 2002 cannot be evaluated as though the passengers had access to information revealed in 2019. Chronology matters. For example, when the name Bill Clinton appears in early 2000s flight logs, that appearance predates the national spotlight that would later intensify around Epstein. The interpretation of those flights changed after 2008, and changed again after Epstein's 2019 arrest. The document did not change. Public context did. The same dynamic applied to discussions surrounding Prince Andrew. Earlier social associations were later re-evaluated once allegations and legal disputes entered the public sphere. The flight logs became part of a broader narrative, but their content remained the same: dates, routes, names. What shifted was perception. The 2008 agreement also fueled distrust. Many observers believed Epstein received preferential treatment. That perception, regardless of one's view on prosecutorial decisions, created an environment in which any documented association appeared more suspect. When trust in institutions declines, documentary evidence is often interpreted more aggressively. This is a sociological effect. If the system appears to protect the powerful, then proximity to power feels inherently suspicious. But suspicion is not proof. The key question is not whether people later regretted association. It is whether the flight logs, viewed in their original time context, document criminal knowledge or participation. They do not. They document travel. Understanding the timeline prevents retrospective distortion. Because without chronological discipline, every past interaction risks being reinterpreted through future events. If 2008 altered interpretation, 2019 intensified it. When Jeffrey Epstein was arrested again in July 2019 on federal sex trafficking charges, global attention surged. But it was his death in August 2019, while in federal custody, that fundamentally reshaped public perception. The official ruling was suicide. But for many observers, the circumstances, combined with Epstein's connections to powerful individuals, triggered immediate suspicion. Trust eroded rapidly. And when trust erodes, documents take on new meaning. The flight logs, already circulating online, were re-examined with heightened intensity. People no longer saw them merely as travel records. They saw them as potential evidence of a hidden structure, a network shielded by influence. This is the moment when the question shifted from who flew to who escaped scrutiny. Names that appeared in the logs were scrutinized more aggressively. Names that did not appear were sometimes questioned just as intensely. The absence of sweeping public indictments beyond Epstein and later Ghislaine Maxwell deepened skepticism in some communities. Maxwell's 2021 conviction for sex trafficking minors confirmed that Epstein did not operate alone. But it did not produce a cascade of charges against high-profile passengers listed in flight logs. For some, that absence reinforced belief in institutional protection. For others, it reflected evidentiary limitations. Here is the crucial point. Public distrust can change how evidence is interpreted, even when the evidence itself does not change. A handwritten log entry from 2001 carries the same factual content regardless of the year in which it is examined. But emotionally, it feels different after scandal, indictment, and death. This is not unique to the Epstein case. In high-profile scandals involving wealth and power, documentation often becomes symbolic of broader anxieties about accountability, privilege, and justice. The flight logs became shorthand for all of those concerns. But symbolism can blur boundaries. A document that proves transportation may be treated as proof of conspiracy. A name on a manifest may be interpreted as confirmation of complicity. Understanding this psychological shift is essential if we want clarity rather than amplification. Public analysis and prosecutorial standards operate in different worlds. Online, a name on a list can feel decisive. In a courtroom, it is only a starting point. When federal authorities reopened the case against Jeffrey Epstein in 2019, prosecutors did not build their indictment around flight logs. They focused on victim testimony, corroborating witnesses, digital records, financial trails, and physical evidence tied to specific alleged acts. Why? Because criminal law requires proof of conduct, not proximity. If a person's name appears in a flight log, investigators may ask follow-up questions. What was the purpose of the trip? Who else was present? Are there communications linked to that date? Is there testimony placing that individual in misconduct? Is there financial evidence suggesting criminal coordination? Without additional evidence, a passenger entry remains circumstantial, and weakly so. This distinction frustrates many observers. In public discourse, the argument often sounds like this: if they were on the plane, they must have known. But legal systems operate on evidence, not assumption. To prosecute someone for criminal conspiracy or participation, authorities must demonstrate knowledge, intent, action. Direct involvement. A flight log proves none of those elements by itself. Consider again former President Bill Clinton. His presence in publicly released logs confirmed travel during specific years. But without evidence tying that travel to criminal acts or knowledge, prosecutors would have no basis for charges. The same legal threshold applies to any name in the logs. Similarly, the conviction of Ghislaine Maxwell was based on witness testimony, documented recruitment behavior, and corroborating evidence, not merely her association or shared travel. Association can justify inquiry. It cannot replace proof. Another critical factor is statute of limitations and jurisdiction. Some alleged conduct occurred decades ago. Prosecutors must operate within defined legal timeframes and evidentiary standards. Public expectation often assumes that investigation equals indictment. But investigation frequently ends without charges, particularly when documentation lacks direct linkage to criminal acts. This is not necessarily exoneration. It is evidentiary limitation. The justice system is designed, imperfectly, but intentionally, to prevent conviction based on proximity alone. That principle protects both the accused and the integrity of the system. After reviewing the Epstein flight logs and public reaction, several key lessons emerge. 1. Presence is not proof. A name on a flight log confirms travel, nothing more. It does not automatically indicate knowledge of criminal activity or participation in wrongdoing. 2. Absence is not exoneration. A missing name does not prove non-association or innocence. It may reflect incomplete records, travel outside the documented timeframe, or different arrangements. 3. Frequency can mislead. Repeated appearances in a log do not establish guilt. They indicate repeated travel. Context is essential to determine relevance. 4. Shared flights do not imply shared intent. Multiple high-profile names on a single entry may appear dramatic, but co-travel does not equal conspiracy. 5. Perception shapes interpretation. Symbolism, media coverage, and public distrust amplify the meaning of flight logs far beyond their factual content. The aircraft became an icon, and every passenger became a character in a larger story, whether or not the documents justified it. 6. Legal standards differ from public speculation. Investigators require evidence of knowledge, intent, and action to pursue charges. Flight logs alone rarely meet that threshold. Ultimately, the logs are administrative documents. They provide insight into Epstein's travel patterns, social reach, and the networks he moved within. They also demonstrate how perception can magnify simple records into symbols of broader societal anxieties about wealth, power, and accountability. For the public, the flight logs became a lens through which to view secrecy and privilege. For courts, they are one piece of evidence, factual, narrow, and context-dependent. Understanding that difference, between symbolism and evidence, between association and action, is essential. It reminds us to question assumptions, seek context, and distinguish between speculation and proof. In the end, the debate over who flew and who didn't is less about the flights themselves and more about what they reveal about power, narrative, and human perception in the age of transparency and suspicion. The documents exist. The questions remain. This channel will continue examining what is public and what is still hidden. If you value documented analysis over speculation, consider subscribing. More files coming.